How's everybody doing this week?
My kids went back to school today, so I'm doing great.
And I'm not recognizing you from some of the previous meetings. Is this your first time with us?
Yeah, I'm the new product marketing manager for open source at Docker. So I'm
Okay.
trying to, get the lay of the land and some of our various foundation memberships and stuff. So suggested
Feels
as a good call for me to join.
feels like something I should have remembered, but Docker's had a lot of new people lately. I'm losing track.
It's very surprising when I talk to somebody and they tell me they've been how many years they've been here. 'Cause I hear a lot. I've been here 7 months.
Well, welcome.
Thank you.
So I know Sajay put me on the agenda. So I'll go ahead and share the notes out. We can kick this thing off, even though Sajay's not here. But looks like he wanted to chat about issue 1101, and I'm guessing also 1100 as well, over on the image spec, where we were just kind of looking at various guidance. And I feel like I wish even if Sajay wasn't here, Tina was here, but because he and I went back and forth a bit on this one. But there are just some questions for what it looks like when we define this. Let me get my screen so I can share it. Might be easier for this. Okay. So the change here was it kind of came from a question from a user of, well, what's better? Do we want the artifact type field? Do we want the config media type? What's the preferred? And every time someone asked me that, I kept going back and saying there is no preferred, which makes nobody happy. But I do at least have somewhat of a decision tree in my head of what makes sense to me. And so this was my logic. Doesn't necessarily mean this is official OCI logic unless we decide to merge the PR. But this is what was coming out of my head. One of the first things that I was doing was I kind of took this phrase out because it kind of got people's attention. This was a copy and paste from the next file I modified, but to say the config media type, it must be a value of something or other, and it got picked up by people that said, "Well, you didn't expand on that," and no, I didn't because it's expanded on the document I linked to. So I had to simplify it down, just saying, "Hey, if the config media type isn't a container image, then the thing it's pointing to is going to be an artifact." And so it's the way that makes a lot of sense to me. That got keyed off or picked up by a TNON on that one that said, well, there are some artifacts that use the config media type set to a container image field. My take on that is that people are doing that are basically doing a little bit of a hack or occlusion in the system to work around registries that are blocking this stuff. And it's not necessarily something we want to be recommending as from OCI, but I want to leave that up to the bigger audience since it's not just me saying that, to see what other people think about how to decide whether or not it is an artifact. The folks have strong opinions either way on that one. Aaron, I see you off mute.
Hello. I think you touched on something interesting there, which is there's really two questions, right? There's what's our guidance is one thing. What do we recommend? And the second is for runtimes. If you're looking at a random manifest, how do you determine if it's an artifact or an image? And the guidance should probably steer people to make that a clear choice. But I think the reality is, because of those pledges people have put in to work around registries, there's going to be artifacts that don't cleanly, obviously fall into the artifact or image category, right? And that's just, I think that's just going to be the unfortunate status quo.
Yeah, I was gonna chime in here with my putting on my Tianwen hat, since Tianwen is actually going to be PTO for quite some time here. I think Tianwen would be the first to agree that what BuildKit is doing is absolutely an ugly kludge, and it really shouldn't have been that way, but it is. And we probably need to fail forward and use language like should, acknowledging that these artifacts already exist, and this is a pattern that people are already. I mean, I think this is what the first implementation of Oris also did, if I remember right. It's a pattern that unfortunately is out there and can't break support for, since it was technically twisting the words of previous iterations of the spec. It was something that was valid to do.
I'm pretty sure all the
Or-
cosign signatures are doing it today as well. So it's.
Oh
we're not
yes,
the
that is how cosign works. Yeah. Yep, that's how they have registry support today. And I mean, it's kind of just undefined behavior in previous versions of the spec. You can just do it, and runtimes accepted it. So I don't think we can change that now.
So I wouldn't say runtimes accepted it. Runtimes are not asked to run it. And so when they are, they
Yeah.
usually aren't too happy with you.
Well, that's kind of what I mean by accepted it. And I say accepted, but in the case of Moby, multiple times we had things break where all of a sudden I can't run an image that has attestations. And oh, we forgot to add the special case, and we have to filter the we have to filter on the layer type. Yeah, it's not a great situation, and it's a leaky abstraction, but the ecosystem mostly has tolerated it up to this point.
Yeah, putting my OCI hat on, the config spec itself, when you look at the definition for that media type, we do say right at the top of that, hey, this specification is talking about the JSON format for use with a container runtime. And so if you're using it for something that's not designed for a container runtime, you're abusing the spec. And I totally get that people have been abusing the spec. Did what they had to do to get something that worked. But I'm just leaning toward, from the OCI guidance, do we lean toward saying, okay, everybody broke the spec in the past, and now we're going to change the spec to handle the breakage? Or do we say, nope, you broke it, and here's the right way to do it going forward?
Well, I mean, is there room language-wise to document that while this may not be true, because there's a couple people who are consumers of the spec, right? There's implementers who are implementing a runtime. There are people who are trying to build a conformant layout. And if you can make it clear that implementers of a runtime, hey, there are artifacts out there that do this. There may be people doing this, but if you're building a new tool that produces OCI layouts, you should not be doing this. I think that is, in your perfect world, that's what you do. But that's been tried with various degrees of success. And I'm thinking of the whole debate over annotations versus labels that is still unresolved with Alexa and Akihiro right now. Trying to split the difference there, I don't think made anybody happy either with the current where that PR is stuck at. So
Yeah, I agree. And I think it would be great to, this is equivalent to a should, right? This is not really actually saying that these artifacts are breaking the spec. This is a should, correct, for this guidance. And
I did not capitalize anything in that sentence. So
okay.
it is not official spec language. It is just,
Okay.
the whole file is
mean-
guidance.
I mean, I will be honest with you, the word will, even if it's not in all caps, people are going to interpret that as binding. And so, fast forward 18 months from now, and somebody is going to open a bug complaining about something not being spec compliant if you use the word will.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would probably try to avoid will, is, must, etc. But I think this entire thing, maybe we could have a passage at the beginning that says that this is purely should guidance for producing artifacts, not necessarily prescriptive, because, and then you can, I think, probably cite some sources. As the OCI image spec committee is aware of, you know, these tools which may deviate from this specification or this guidance. I think that's probably as best as we can do.
I'm gonna look for the term that got us in trouble before. Yeah, the term that got us in before when we specify the media type on a descriptor, it's this the required property that contains the media type for the reference content. We're saying required, and that it must comply with this. This was where we got in trouble earlier when we were trying to define the empty descriptor, or when we came in and decided we needed to define the empty descriptor, is that you point to a media type that wasn't the same. So I think we're okay enough that people that have been abusing this have also been abusing the content itself, and they are passing some root FS layers and other stuff inside of that blob. But I do want to keep in mind that there is a implicit must somewhere under the covers there, that if you define it with that media type, that you're also including that JSON content as well.
I guess what you're saying is there is a must, there is a must include layers, but not necessarily only layers. Right. And when I talk about runtimes accepting, I mean, I'm mostly coming back to like the container D is layer type function, which is horrible, but it is widely used, and that logic is the fact that it's proliferated everywhere is what makes me think that, you know, this isn't going to go away in the medium term.
Yeah, it's not going to go away. I don't want to say that anybody that's doing it now is, well, they're bad. I would be comfortable saying they're not OCI compliant, because there's a lot of stuff out there that we do that is not OCI compliant. That wouldn't bother me too much. So Sasha, I see you joined in here. This was the issue that you want us to chat about.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No worries.
Like jumping between meetings. Yeah,
We're
Atieno
all
mentioned
Go
that
ahead.
he couldn't come on these calls, right? So, but he's also kind of like leaving comments on the issue. What's been the general consensus? I think what I'm trying to understand is we're also trying to make a few decisions as to how do we tell customers when to use artifact type, when not to use it, and things like that. So I think we just want to probably formulate this to some extent and then go with it. I think that was my thinking out of this.
We still have 45 minutes to get to that part. We're still on line one.
Yeah, I wonder if language around deprecation is maybe productive here, because that is to say, like, these are so arguably, if it's not a layer, it shouldn't be used. I mean, not arguably, if it's not a layer, it shouldn't be using the layer media type in a world where we have artifacts. You still have to handle the case of there being non-layer layers, something that claims it's a layer but actually isn't. But certainly anybody who's trying to produce something that's packaged in an OCI format going forward shouldn't be doing that. So I just wonder if, you know, the deprecated wording is enough to imply that implementers of runtimes, you might have to handle this. There could be things in there that aren't layers, and you should be looking and not trying to treat them as layers, which is that container D helper. But implementers who are producing layouts, you should not do this going forward. You should only ever put layers in something that says it contains layers in a world where artifacts are available. They should be preferred for any new implementation.
Yeah, the layers part below, I'm more flexible on, I guess. It's to me, it's when we say that this is a config media type for an OCI image, and it's not an OCI image, that gets me a little bit concerned, but I would be comfortable enough saying should not. If someone wanted me to make that change instead of will not to should not, I can at least work with that. And since this is guidance, I think I would even say lowercase should, even though it, that way I'm not officially making spec language, but I'm using words that people that read the spec language are more comfortable with.
So the concern here is to if somebody uses the image config media type, but it somehow isn't an image.
So to give you a specific, Sajay, people that are today already doing that.
That's
So-
what I was thinking. So, but is that the concern? So are we having a concern on what the current behavior is?
We have a concern on writing in here that if someone does that, they're not following our guidance. And to me, I'm comfortable enough saying if you do that, that's not my guidance. I don't want to guide people to do that.
I think one pattern is, is there a possibility to show how to rather than describe how not to? Right? Anything that's out of this set is you're on your own at that point. I was wondering if you could kind of like pivot on that. For example, we've already called out that images should have this media type. Is there any reason to say that images artifacts should not have this media type? It is exclusive to some extent, right?
So there's an infinite list of config media types that they can have that would be an artifact, and there is a single item list of things that they should have if they're a container image.
Yes. All I'm saying is it's already defined that this config media type is an image. Do we even need to call this out here? Because if somebody wants to use an image, they're going to use that config media type. Agreed that people might do things like storing, I don't know, anything into the config, but
I mean, I think it's important to have the guidance because there are plenty of implementations out there, which if I was to go look at how Cosign or BuildKit are implemented today, they are putting not layer things into a image config shaped object. And the tools that are aware of that are either, well, tools either do nothing and they pretend that that data doesn't exist, or they know how to interpret it, but it is packing things into a schema that wasn't designed for this as a way to work around registry support. And so I can go look at that implementation and think that this is the way to do it. But in a world where we have artifacts, nobody should really be doing that anymore, because that was the entire point of this work, was to come up with something better than trying to create a non-runnable image and, you know, stuff all your data in there.
okay, I don't have any concern with putting the clause in. I'm asking for kind of like a way to get out of the logjam. If people want to kind of like have this called out that the image.config is kind of reserved for an image, then yeah, I think it's fair to kind of recommend don't do it. Yeah, you're always free to step away from the recommendation, and there's a guidance, should be okay.
There's a lot of stuff out there that's not OCI compliant.
Yeah, I mean, I was following this thread, and like we've handled WillKit, we've handled cosign signature. It's all there. So
well, and personally, I would be inclined to just even add an acknowledgement of existing tools have done this, and this is, you know, even maybe this is how they did it, but this is why you shouldn't, you know, please don't do that. I mean, obviously something a lot more formal than that, but I don't think it's necessarily bad to acknowledge that you might come across existing tools that do pack non-layer data into an image config in the layers field. You know, please don't do that going forward. Refer to the artifacts documentation instead. You know, I do say that with the caveat of like, that's, you know, I was bringing up the annotations versus labels on the the runtime spec earlier of like, that's essentially what the current PR does and nobody really likes it. So maybe that's wouldn't work here. But I am going to suggest that despite the fact that I'm opposed to it in that other case where somebody is trying to do the same thing.
Yeah, I am very comfortable with your recommendation that we document that there are cases out there that have not followed this guidance. That makes perfect sense to me. I can put that in.
Yeah, I think I feel comfortable with that as well. Like, we don't want to use the OCI image config media type anywhere else, because that's kind of what we determine that it is an image, but we can no way figure out that it's an image without actually inspecting the config block now. So it makes sense to me. I just wanted to kind of like find out if it is blocking or anything like that.
Yeah, so that change I can make easy enough. Now we get to the fun part, I guess. So I guess we don't have, yeah, this person is not here, and I think this is outside the scope of what we're talking about, so I'm going to ignore this one for now. And then we get to Tianan's comment here. So this is the question I think would make sense to go up to the bigger group rather than just having me and Tianan go back and forth on it, which is, does it make sense to say the forward advice is that if you have an artifact, you should always define the artifact type field, even if it's the same thing as your config media type field?
Do you mind if I give some context? We had a bunch of debates that I can maybe summarize, but I'll probably do a pretty bad job at it. So we've been discussing how there's going to be producers going to make this choice and consumers going to be making this choice. The challenge that we were facing is when we publish images, there's a bunch of events that we need to send out and fan out and all that. Every place we are having to like double check config media type, artifact type, and this is like multiple places, right? So also, if you have tools that are going to compose with like just a JSON event and like no code kind of tools, they have to do if blocks and whatnot. So generally, there was a sense of a very simplistic approach of can we check one field. The internal discussion was unify that and give another field out if the spec doesn't do it. My thinking is if the spec can do it, then we don't need to do those other fields. So it's about how do you want to reflect that going forward? And I also see there's redundant information that's there. So I'm looking at it from a producer consumer standpoint. The producer decision tree is pretty large, right? Like 0.4 is if X, if I mean, I literally wrote the decision tree. I kind of copied your decision tree and tried to kind of like describe it internally, and it was getting harder. So I'm hoping that we can take that input, and I didn't want to put it in here because it was hard to kind of articulate what they were saying. But long story short, how many places will we check these two fields going forward is also becoming challenging. But if this is the guidance that we want to go with, I don't have any reason to push back. But this is a problem that might exist. This is kind of what I want to highlight.
Yeah, so the take that I was giving on this one was that I'm not strongly opposed. It's extra data. You're kind of duplicating, feels a little redundant. But that if you are trying to simplify the decision, when do you change all the code so that all you look at is the artifact type and that's all you're looking at? Because there's a lot of stuff out there today that already exists that is an artifact. Helm charts, all this other content that's out in registries that only has a config media type. And so at what point do we break all that existing content?
I don't think there's anything breaking here, right? Like those clients can continue producing it with config media type. You're not telling them to move. I think the idea is this is guidance looking forward. If you have support for this, use the artifact type. The other point I wanted to bring was we're doing this because we could not null the config blob out. We cannot null the layers blob out and things like that. And technically, if we in V2, we say that config media type is not required, then artifact type is there for them to kind of use that. So I was going down that path where it's one decision tree. It's simple that if it's an artifact type, look here, but everything else kind of sticks as an image. Anyway, I'll yield.
I guess maybe I'm not quite following which way Sajay is arguing myself, but what seems from a spec standpoint, what seems obvious to me is that it doesn't hurt to have the redundancy. I mean, it is in the case of in case of the artifact type being the same, you are printing the same information twice, but it greatly simplifies the implementation. Not in that like adding an extra conditional is a lot of work, but then it makes it just harder to screw up. And then some future OCI 2.0 that's allowed to make breaking changes can say, oh yeah, this is redundant information, we can drop it. But from a spec standpoint, being aggressively backwards compatible and expanding the schema, but also making it easy for old implementations and for new implementations to get things right the first time does seem to be the right way to me.
So you're saying drop it and
No, so I'm saying provide it, just unconditionally always set artifact type so that implementations have to make as few decisions as possible. It's harder to screw up because there's fewer lines of code.
I started that sentence in the wrong place. You're talking about the config descriptor. You're thinking, okay, that's going to be duplicate of the artifact type. So in the future, we can just drop the config descriptor completely from a future version of the spec is kind of a thought process you're going down.
If the duplication offends people, like by all means, but specifications are for interoperability, describing what people do in the real world, but also have to often be bent to existing implementations or implementation concerns, at least.
So
I don't think it's too impure.
Problem with that is item number 3, this point of the decision tree, is when you absolutely have a config blob. So when I'm working through my decision tree, I'm saying, do I have a config blob? And layers, that kind of stuff? No config blob, just nothing. Just go ahead and generate that way. Section 2 is, okay, well, I've got layers. So do a layer artifact type field. Config blob is with the empty descriptor. And then 3 here is where you get to saying, I actually do have a blob of config that I need to package in and ship out with my artifact itself. And so I do need to fill in that config descriptor field. I can't get rid of it. Do I also have to populate that artifact type? That's where we're at.
Right. So what I'm saying is I don't think it hurts anything to just suggest people populate the artifact type unconditionally. So regardless of whether or not you have a config, and whether or not, I mean, really what this is whether or not the artifact type is different from the media type in the case of having, well, I guess that would be case 4 below.
That's 4 is when they're different.
Right.
So that was where you actually needed it again.
That's where it's necessary. But even in the case, I guess what I'm saying is coalescing 3 and 4 together so that you don't make a different decision based on whether or not you want to have an artifact type that's different from your media type.
Does that mean that we need to have some kind of call out here of saying there is a lot of artifacts out there already that didn't do any of this advice?
I think that's the backward compat story, and we shouldn't drop support for that. There's no reason to, but going forward, we can definitely guide. Yeah, if it's an artifact, just put in the field. The other thing, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think like the above case, it doesn't necessarily hurt to acknowledge hey, existing implementations did this, and that when inspecting their output, this is why you might not find this everywhere in the wild. But I think it's maybe less beneficial than the above case where we were talking about the media type.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, you don't necessarily need a specific example, just, this decision tree should be preferred for new implementations. There are other implementations out there that may not have done this for various historical reasons. Please refer to this as the official guidance, and if in doubt, open an issue. I mean, essentially.
Yeah, the reason for my hesitation was less the redundancy and more that I'm worried people will look to this decision tree and see that artifact type is always defined, write their code assuming that it's always defined, and then find out that it doesn't work with all the pre-existing artifacts.
I think that's fair as a concern, and maybe addressing that. The current implementation uses config media type might be the thing to go forward with.
I mean, I think making it clear that this is guidance for creating an image, but doesn't describe the only valid way to create one that's allowed by the spec is important. Calling that out of Because to be fair, this is no longer in the guidance for artifact authors file, but making it clear that other combinations are possible and implementations, linked to the section to spec where it's described, where the fallback is described, that implementations must keep this in mind if you want to be really paranoid.
So we'll have a 3-bullet guidance of, no items, just something in a layer, single artifact in there, or something that has a config in the layer. All 3 of those will have an artifact type, and then have a section after that and says also, for example, you will see a lot of artifacts that look like Y. This 4th case, just for your awareness, if you're writing anything that's interpreting it. Is that kind of the direction everybody is comfortable with? Sanjay was almost comfortable with it.
The only suggestion I would make there is just linking back to the spec, like not just making it clear that, yeah, you might. So in the case of you provide an example of Y, which would be like, say, the Helm chart case, make it clear that that's not the only one that's possible either, and that the final word for people interpreting images is the full spec language describing the fields.
Yeah, this specific bit is actually in the manifest spec. It's at the end of the file, and it's just saying, hey, we document the entire what the JSON spec is. Here's how some people are using it with our guidance.
Right.
So
and that's kind of what I mean, is just linking back, reminding people that this is guidance on how to interpret, but not, this logic should not be used to write a correct implementation of artifact handling, of interpreting artifacts, but for creating them, it's good.
So I think what I'm understanding is that we'll probably modify it to guide with redundancy for now. If there is a config blob, even either match, or they can have a different, for example, Helm does have Helm dot plus config JSON and things like that. Technically, they could just have an artifact type called applications Helm or whatever they want to, which might be different, but we don't mind making it redundant is what I'm understanding. Is that okay?
I think that's what we're thinking. And to kind of go along with the previous comment of separate that this is the guidance for creating, and if you're going to be reading, you should probably read according to the spec, which we document in this file. That way people can do all kinds of stuff that's within spec that's not according to our guidance. I feel like I should be queuing up Ram at that point on that comment. In case he wants to chime in or not.
No, I mean, my general comment is it is the lack of guidance that has made it a Wild West, right? So if you have guidance, hopefully things converge there.
Well, so we will get this document, and that way we're all creating this stuff the same way. And
yes, that's what
confusing.
that's what this will hopefully achieve. Yes, otherwise it's if there is no guidance, then all you need is one client tool and one the server tool to agree on each other, and they just go forward, right? So it doesn't quite work if you want to standardize.
If you get 90% of people to do it the blessed way, the 10% of case, and then you have 10% of cases where people are on the edges of the spec language, or wow, I never thought to interpret it that way, but I can see how you read that. Okay, we're going to have to adapt to this. At least those cases become less common if most people take the safe default, unless they have a strong reason to do otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So exactly what you're saying, to give people some context of what Ram and I went back and forth on a bit ago, was reading the spec. You could just as easily say, I'm going to package together an SPDX SBOM and ship the SBOM as the config blob and leave the layer descriptor as empty. And it's within spec, but the guidance never said that that was good or bad. And so if everybody is going to be trying to read SBOMs for container images, it would be good if we were all generating the same way so that anybody is trying to consume them can follow the same pattern too.
And that would really be the big achievement out of this work.
That's my hope. If nothing else, we'll have Nisha show up at some point in the future and be like, you guys actually did it right. Cool. So I've got some action items on updating this. Anybody else have feedback on this one that I should be taking into account?
I think the thing that tripped us was do not set the artifact type. I think if that is clarified as please set the artifact type, that will make the decision tree for all artifacts to set it.
I'm going to drop this down from 4 items to 3 items. And the third item is going to be if you have a config blob, you're still setting the artifact type, whether or not it's the same or different. And then what I'm going to have is after that, an example that just says, FYI, this is guidance for creating it. When you're consuming it, people will do things a lot differently. For example, a lot of artifacts look like this and give you one without the artifact type. And it's a lot of back and forth, but I think it's for a good reason because everybody reads this stuff differently. So this is a good exercise for us. If I do that, I'll probably take into account, this thing is scrolling very slow, the other open issue. I'll probably upset them when I do it, but I'll probably take into account the workflow that was being done. Does he have a name here? Okay, I'm not going to be able to pronounce it, so I won't try to pronounce it. But the pattern that was worked on over here was intermixing the two. It was to say, here's the guidance, here's what it looks like. Here's more guidance, here's what it looks like. Does that seem like a good method for other people to read this? To include a sample JSON with each one of the steps in the logic tree.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, because at least this is a concrete example I can just refer to.
We'll be getting these 2 PRs will be getting kind of combined into one. I'll see if I can make him a co-author or something on this thing. All right. Those were our 2 items for the day. Like I say, I've got action items to take care of on that one. Does anybody have other agenda items you want to talk about today?
Are we still on for the August 18th deadline? Where
So
the
that comes down,
the RFC window closes.
that comes down to the 6-week hard deadline that some people proposed. I've got my own personal one that's different, but I will let others chime in on how they feel about it. I would love to see a few more implementations out there. And when I say a few more implementations, I would be comfortable seeing ECR, ACR, Docker Hub, and these people that have implementations that they can't go public with to run the conformance test against your private testing and just show those results to say, hey, we ran through our own internal stuff, our internal registry we can't make public yet. And here's our report that just shows that it's all green. You don't have to, we don't have to merge it or commit anything, but just either come here or put up a draft PR or something like that, just to say, hey, we've tested this in our private repo and it looks good. I'm not sure from the registry operators. We've got a bunch of them in here. Everybody's getting quiet when I say talk about that stuff. You can even censor out all the stuff that has like your internal registry server names that you don't want to publicize.
I mean, we burnt them with the artifact manifest. I think that should be fair. Asking more is probably unfair at this point. It's what I'm thinking. So I want to be cognizant of there's a little bit of give and take, right? Like if I think silence is kind of like saying that there's no concern.
My fear is we have put stuff into the conformance test before that we then came later on and was just like, oh, that didn't work. And then I've run through and tested stuff and I'm like, oh, this is panicking against some well-known registries out there. And I just feel like nobody's actually run the test. I feel like everybody's saying, yeah, the spec looks good, we'll go ahead and support it, but nobody's actually run the test to prove it. When we tag this thing, you can't retag it. It's done. We can't go back and fix the conformance test to make it actually work right. So we're at that point, we're done. It's out. Go back to silence. Maybe I'm putting the fear of everybody. Maybe everybody's like, man, that brand guy just won't let it up. But I get nervous when I see panics coming out of the conformance test.
A lot of silence. Okay, is there anything more?
No, so there was so Sajay, you did reach out to all these people and filed a bunch of issues on what folks think about the conformance, but I was just trying to look it up on how many people responded and how many people have not.
I've seen a fair number of responses. A lot of them are more on the client side. And most of them have said visually looking through the spec changes, they don't see anything that concerns them. There are not a lot of people saying, okay, I've taken this, I've implemented it, it actually works. They haven't taken that second step.
Anyway, maybe I should just comment on this one. What we have about a week's time in. What I'm planning to do is we'll open up a vote and take it from there as planned. And if there's anything that folks can do during that time, we'll still have a week before which we cut. It's probably the standard operating procedure at this point. I hear Brandon. I hear like your side, so need to compromise somewhere. But forever waiting is not a possibility also, and early cutting is also not a possibility. So that's why we kind of took that time and went with it. I almost feel like I want to say don't shoot the messenger, but kind of make everybody.
I'm trying to find the most flexible way to get that feedback. And so that's why I was saying, hey, if just to have someone say, we ran this test, we can't show you all the details, but we actually did run your conformance test. We have a server that we can't present to you that everything shows up as green. I'm trying to look for some kind of happy medium in there. Is there anybody that runs a registry a day that has run the conformance test? The 1.1. Rom, you don't count. Not that Rom, you don't count, but you're one example right now along with myself. So I'm trying to get a second. Yeah. That's my fear. That's what I'm hoping we get past. So everybody's got a week to actually run a test. The code is out there.
I think we can, I think we can just send a reminder to the original issues that were filed and just say that the RFC window is closing soon. And we would like to hear back.
Yeah, getting them to publish a conformance test is a pretty, I mean, they'll have to schedule something and get it run, and it's a commitment. But most folks who, at least from the folks I've spoken, they haven't raised any concerns. And that's why we're kind of getting down, how do you produce, how do you test? It's all the tests that they're writing. So I think it might be Shuey or Bin who spoke from the Azure side, but I can follow up again.
I mean, I've run it on a fair number of registries I've worked against. I've run it against the Google Grow Container Registry. I've kicked it off on the Harvard demo. You know, if there's an API endpoint you have right access to, anybody can run it.
And that's really the point, right? It is that anybody from the client side is able to run this test.
All right, so I've got my work to do. All the registry operators have their work to do. Come back in a week when we get this all knocked out. Trying to end on a high note here.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everybody.